Great. It's 3:02, so I'm going to kick off. My name's Colin Pereira. I'm a director of RiskPal, and welcome to our safety outlook for 2025. This is an event we've been running for quite a few years, although we actually missed out on running it in 2024, mainly because we were so busy. So I'm very grateful to have it back on the agenda. It's always proved highly successful. And I'm joined by a great panel who will introduce themselves shortly. But one of the reasons why we liked to run this event is because it gives us a chance to sit down and reflect about the things that might be coming up in the months ahead. And I think in 2025, the thing that we are very conscious of is that things are going to be very uncertain. And one of the things I always sort of reflect on at the end of the year is the word of the year that I think reflects the mood of the year. And I was looking at the last few years, the word of the year, and I think they're very apt and kind of sum up the 2020s. Well, in 2021, it was vaccine, and we were in the uncertainty of the pandemic. 2022 was perma-crisis, which was obviously reflecting the invasion of Ukraine and a number of crises around the world. 2023, the word was hallucinate, which reflects the situation about AI and the dawn of AI. But last year, it was polarization, or if you go to the Oxford University, it's brain rot. And brain rot reflecting the overwhelming information deluge that we're all experiencing. I won't ask the panel to speculate what the word of 2025 would be. Based on current events, it's probably going to be inferno, given what's happening in LA. Hopefully things will change. But what we will be doing is a bit of horizon gazing into the crises or assignments and stories that we will be covering, and also getting from our panel insights into the how journalists will tackle the safety issues that we face. I think it's worth remembering that in 2024, 98 journalists were killed, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 74 of whom were in Israel and the occupied territories, which is quite a staggering figure. And at RiskPal, what we do is we specialize helping media organizations and NGOs and businesses operate in high-risk locations, and we try and improve their behaviors in terms of preventing problems, and then we have to fix them if they do go wrong. And we've deliberately picked this panel. I'm very pleased to say they were our first pick. Everyone said yes the first time around. And we picked them because they, one, all come from news organizations that represent or are undergoing change when it comes to safety. They're all embracing the change of the different safety requirements as they come up in 2025. And the other thing that we've done is we picked Leila, Oksana and Phil, who are all at different levels of a news organization. So we're hoping to get the view from the ground, the view from the engine room, and the view from on top. So on that note, I'm going to stop and just invite the panel to introduce themselves. I'm going to start with who I see going right to left in my panel. So it's Oksana. Do you want to tell everyone who you are and what you do for the FT?
Hi, everyone. I'm Oksana Rondel. I'm the Deputy Managing Editor at the Financial Times. I've been at the FT for 17 years in various roles in the Managing Editor's office. Our office basically is responsible for all editorial operations, and we are the link between the newsroom and the rest of the FT. My main focus in this role, and I've been in this role for about a year now, is safety and security of our journalists.
Leila, do you want to go next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Leila Molana-Allen. I'm a special correspondent for the PBS Newshour, and I cover mostly the Middle East and Africa. And over the last 12 months or so, I spent most of my time in Syria, Lebanon, Sudan, and Israel and the Palestinian territories.
Great. And Leila's being very modest. She's also the holder of the one of the Peabody Awards and also the Kathy Gannon Legacy Award in 2024. Phil?
Hi, I'm Phil Chetwynd. So I'm the Global News Director of the international news agency AFP, which means basically I have overall responsibility for all the content and all the journalists, the 1,800 journalists we have at AFP, everything ultimately comes to my door. I've been in this role for about 6 years, which tends to be much more big picture strategy, rather than the day-to-day. I was editor-in-chief of AFP for 6 years before taking this role, so that was really day-to-day. Really, I would say in the 12 years I've been in these two roles, everything around security and mental health have been a huge sort of priority in terms of us, building up capacity on that. So, and those issues are never more relevant than they are at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. And I just want to remind the audience before we start that this session is being recorded and it will be put on YouTube. And if you do have any questions, please just put them into the chat as we go. I will try and address them as we go, but we do have a lot to cover. And I want to start off with you, Phil. Just tell me how you, sitting on the strategic pinnacle of a major news organization, how do you see the state of journalism around the world right now?
I think this is an incredibly fragile moment. I just brought all my key editors from around the world for a week of discussions in Paris just in December, and we spent the first sort of morning just auditing the situation around the world. And if you really look at the quantity of countries where journalists are now under tremendous pressure, there's this autocratic populist wave going around the world. We tend to focus on the big countries that we know about. So we obviously, there's a lot of focus on what's happening in the States at the moment. In Latin America, you tend to focus on, say, Argentina, in Europe, Slovakia or Hungary and so on. But when you really drill down, it is a huge swathe of the world now where there is a tremendous pressure on journalists. Pressure could be, abuse, cyber abuse, threats of legal investigations, tax investigations. This, for me, at this point in time, is a tremendously vulnerable moment. I think, given, added to that, the recent changes you've seen at X and Meta, which basically is saying these massive information spaces now are places that we are not really going to dedicate to fact and truth, and where trolls and misinformation can thrive. So I think that there's a level of vulnerability now for our teams around the world that and also for the whole profession, that frankly I think I say this frequently to my team. I think this is the most complicated time to be a journalist since I've been alive. That's how I would frame it.
Right. And Leila, you're someone who is on the front line, facing the threats for real on a personal level. You've spent most of 2024 bopping in and out of war zones across the Middle East, and you spent the end of the year in Syria. Tell us about Syria. Tell us what it's like to be a journalist these days, in those kind of environments.
Well, theoretically, Syria was safer when I was there at the end of the year than it's been for a very long time. It was particularly jarring for me because I'd managed to get in undercover the year before, when, of course, it was deeply oppressive. I had Mukhabarat intelligence officers trying to track me down throughout my time being there, and was desperately trying to protect both my sources and the people who were helping me get around. So when we drove into Syria, on a couple of days after Assad fell on December 8th, it was mad to essentially be able to do what you like. But of course, you were doing what you like with absolutely no idea what the consequences would be, who was there. So we drove across the border from Lebanon, no security whatsoever, except a teenage boy with a gun on the border from the Free Syrian Army, and then drove around the country for a bit over a week. And yes, there were no longer intelligence officers around, but there were increasing numbers of gangs, thugs, robbery on the roads at night. And of course, there are HTS and other militiamen across the country who, this isn't a regulated organization yet, particularly once they've come outside of Idlib, because they're very carefully controlled there. But across the country, they've had thousands of new signups over the last few years. And so anything that comes from top down isn't necessarily going to be implemented. And we've already heard that in terms of what's happening with women. There have been threats made against women in positions of power all over the country. We have no idea if that's going to translate to journalists. Of course, course, it's likely to affect Syrian and Arab female journalists first, but that could quickly change. And of course, there are many Syrian and Arab journalists who've gone into the country already. Already, we're starting to see that crackdown happen. When I was there were absolutely no permits needed for anything. They slowly started introducing permits for things like former government properties, Assad properties, etc. Now they've brought back in the old Syrian government permission form to get in. They're being extremely controlling about who they let in. They've turned away a lot of journalists. And questions are back like, have you ever entered Syria illegally? What does that mean? What do they want to use that information for? And there are multiple questions asking very detailed information about exactly what your story is going to be, exactly where you're going to go. We don't yet know whether they're going to follow you, that we don't know, there'll be minders. We don't yet know if they will follow up on your stories and either ban people or there will be consequences for your fixes in country. And of course, the other issue is that most fixers have no experience working outside of Idlib and West Aleppo because they haven't been allowed to go to any of these areas in the rest of the country for a decade, more than a decade in many cases. So we were in a situation where the drivers had no idea where they were going. They hadn't driven on these roads. I'd been to all these cities more recently than they had. The fixers had no idea what they were doing, who they were meeting, what places even looked like anymore. So you're really dealing with a very unstable situation, which can lead to incredible journalism, but also huge risk. So of all the many risky places I went to last year, I would say Syria is right now, of course, the most kind of highly populated with journalists in the world, but also the most unstable in that way. Obviously, the other places that I spent much of the year on the ground are very high risk for different reasons. Lebanon was probably the riskiest thing I did last year, which many people wouldn't necessarily realize. It really was a kind of free for all with the IDF. There were no permissions at all given for journalists to go south, anywhere south of initially Saida, which is just south of Beirut. And even then, after that, anywhere south of the capital. And of course, they were bombing around the capital as well. Of course, we've seen my friends, colleagues of Phil's and others who've been hit on that front line. So, it was incredibly risky doing anything there, and things like you'd hand information to UNIFIL, who are the UN peacekeepers, and they'd say, we're passing it on to the IDF. We don't get any response. So essentially, this isn't an insurance policy to keep you safe, and it's an insurance policy so that if you die and there's a court case, we can say, well, we told them and they knew you were there. Drones everywhere. No warnings at all. There's no form of shelters or structures that are hardened anywhere in Lebanon, really. So that was an incredibly cowboy journalism to a certain extent. You really had to make minute by minute decisions. And I, as somebody who lived there for 8 years and knew the terrain incredibly well, was able to do that for my team. But many, many of the journalists operating there weren't. By way of an anecdote, there was a recent discussion in one of our groups about, what sort of risks you should be taking and putting other journalists at risk after some journalists drove down and were shot at by the IDF. They obviously say they should be able to work as they should, but at the same time, that puts everyone at more risk. It's a really, really difficult situation to work in there. And then Sudan, obviously, you've got militias and quite unstructured military forces working there as well. So that's a whole different level of threat too. So very.
So we'll come back. We'll come back to Sudan and go into more depth because I want to touch on all of Africa. Obviously, Africa is a massive place, not a monolithic whole. But I want to bring Oksana in. Oksana has to commission people on the ground, journalists like you, Leila. You mentioned words like cowboy journalism. Do what you like. I saw Oksana wince at that point when you said that. Oksana, what's it like being the decision maker who decides who goes in and when to go?
Colin, we don't actually, so I wouldn't make the decision who is commissioned, but I have to work very closely with having a little bit of technical issues, having to work very closely with our foreign editor, with our regional editors on who they commission and basically what we do from there. I did wince at Leila's comments about basically this cowboy style journalism. That's what we've been working on in the last 2 years on making sure we avoid that, making sure there are no commissions, random commissions that happen without our knowledge, and that we have a plan for basically any situation, and we know who goes where. And if it's not one of our journalists, if it's not someone who's already in the region, if we are commissioning someone externally, that we are fully in the loop and that we follow our usual processes and procedures, especially in situations like Syria, where things have escalated. And I mean, everything happens so quickly and everyone gets very excited. So we have to make sure that the news desks, that the editors, the regional editors communicate with us.
And I mean, that's a bit of change for your news desks, right? How are you overseeing this? How are you making this happen? Because a lot of news organizations we work with, there is this sort of legacy issue of, as you say, someone gets very excited on the news desk, there's a breaking story, a freelancer phones up and says, I'm there, I'm on the spot. And they say, great, we'll take this right away. And safety is an afterthought. How are you managing this change, Oksana?
It's changing the mindset that safety is not an afterthought, and making sure that there's constant flow of communication with the desk, with the world desk in this case. And this is one of the reasons why we occasionally, as you know, bring in external advisors to make sure that we constantly reiterate the same things. There are different levels of risk and we have to adopt our process. We're in the last couple of years, we've primarily focused on conflict zones and how we manage that and how we make sure that people aren't commissioned because everyone's excited because the story is happening. But it's a repetitive exercise, and it's taken years, obviously, to change and adapt culturally to make sure that there is no this kind of sudden enthusiasm and basically commissioning without us being involved and without everyone being aware of that there are processes, there are risk assessments, and that we have to stick to those processes.
Okay, great. And now obviously AFP and FT take this very seriously, but Leila, you're on the ground. Are you seeing this from the media fraternity as a whole? I know you told me there are a lot of independents, a lot of local nationals, just running around quite madly.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not seeing this at all. As somebody who sort of came into the industry, around the time that Tim Hetherington and Chris Hodnross were killed. I actually met them just before they were killed. And so really that kind of movement started, particularly for freelancers, at around the time that I started as a correspondent. And I have seen things getting worse. What I've seen is them becoming more polarized. So at the top end of things, where correspondents are concerned, where staffers are concerned, people are very well taken care of. There's a lot of, careful treatment of things. I'm certainly very well taken care of in my role. I have access to a risk advisor, one on the ground if I want one, to all sorts of risk assessments. That is simply not the case with a huge amount of the content that is being made. I'm seeing, and this is my own personal drum that I beat outside of my job. When I was in Lebanon, I started organizing, getting flak jackets and gear and getting funding to do HEFAT training for freelancers in their early to mid-20s, simply because they were being suddenly assigned to go to the front line by editors with absolutely no experience, no training, and no equipment. And those questions weren't even being asked. And when they were asked, they would be told that there was no budget. Even after I bought with my own money flak jackets to supply them at a very cheap rate so that they could say to their editors, look, there's a really cheap flak jacket here that we can rent, the idea of the rental being that otherwise people do take free ones and they just keep them so they're not accessible for everyone. They were told again, there's no budget for that. Now that simply shouldn't be allowed, but unfortunately it's what we see a huge amount of the time. And it's very understandable that, the way that people get into this industry often is that they go somewhere, they learn about the place, and then they're on hand when there's a crisis, and they should be able to get into the industry that way. It's a fantastic way to learn and become a great on-the-ground correspondent, but only if the people who are commissioning you take responsibility for your safety. And in my opinion, there should be far better safeguards to ensure that it's impossible to commission without those things, and there are serious consequences for editors that do. Now, the solution to that is not, as it was maybe 5-10 years ago, there was a sort of panic, and for a while freelancers weren't commissioned at all. Freelancers are an incredibly important part of our industry, and much of the best content out there is made by them, the ones who lived there for years and know exactly what they're talking about, but they must be protected. And I'm seeing more and more, I mean, particularly since October 7th across the Middle East, the level of young and experienced people. And often even actually, that's not true necessarily. A few of the people that I trained on this training had been working for some of the biggest organizations in the world, all of whose names we know, for nearly a decade as fixers, and still had not been trained or supplied flak jackets. So unfortunately, I haven't seen an improvement at all.
Okay, now, Phil, I know this is an issue you take really seriously at AFP. You went through the Arab Spring. If you could share some of your experiences during the Arab Spring commissioning freelancers, but you don't have the luxury of saying no to freelancers because you're AFP and they're some of the lifeblood of your organization. How are you managing this issue?
Yeah, well, it's a mix of things in that we also often have, a certain level of staff in an area. So even in Damascus, we have a public service mission. So even in the north of Syria or in Damascus, we never stopped covering that. So we still, even, the fall of Damascus, we had 3 members of staff and an office in Damascus. And in the north, we have 2 full-time people who work for us. What we did during, it was the Syrian conflict, I think, that really forced us to change the way we worked. Whereas we were realizing simply by taking content from people in Syria that it was encouraging other people to go into Syria to take that risk. So I'm going to go into it. There was a photographer who died in Syria, a French photographer, and in his sort of diary, after he was killed, he said, I'm risking my life and I don't even know if AFP is going to take my content. Now, we never even had any contact with him. But the fact that in his mind, he thought I'm going to make content for AFP, was a real wake-up call. So since then, we've said we will tell people we will not take content on spec from people going in. But we need freelancers. So freelancers or people who are more long-term collaborators with us. And so we have no qualms about flying people to Paris for HEFAT training or elsewhere. We have no qualms about equipping people with flak jackets and everything and doing training. For example, in Gaza, we have a team of 9 staff, all of whom we finally managed to get out after about 9 months. And we had to get them out, but we had to leave it to, we had to create a team behind, so the team that we left behind, we only equipped, or we only created a team big enough for the amount of flak jackets and material and so on that we could give. All of them, we spent time training on all the protocols of AFP. We had 2 or 3 months to do that. And that's a really firm commitment where we're just like, you cannot do that. The 2 regular freelancers from Idlib who made it down to Damascus with the HTS before other people, both of them we take them out to Europe for 2 weeks of training, I think last year before, to make them understand how we work. Because it's not just training them and giving them material, it's also explaining to them what we don't want them to do. Because otherwise there's a tendency just to, do really crazy things, thinking that the big bosses in far away, that's what they want. It's also to say, look, that's not worth doing. This is the way we work. Your security is important to us. So that's something we've really been working on for 10 years. And I think it's had quite a big impact for us.
Yeah, and I know you had a fatality in Ukraine, Armin Soldan. Yeah. You had a serious injury in Lebanon. And I've been privileged enough to work with you on your sort of crisis management. How is that impacting change? Training your managers in how to manage difficult situations and think more about safety. Are you seeing a sea change in AFP?
Well, it's massive. When you lose someone, it's unimaginable. And for so long, when I was editor-in-chief, I kept saying, God, we're lucky. I kept thinking we were lucky. We nearly had people kidnapped in Syria. We nearly had this. We nearly had that. We had a lot of incidents, but I kept thinking, crumbs. We really have been lucky, and we've had a horrendous sort of 18 months. We lost one of our journalists in Ukraine. We nearly lost another in Ukraine. We had Christina Assi, one of our photographers in the south of Lebanon, who very nearly died and had a leg amputated 6 months, basically in intensive care. That's been a period that's really marked us. We've learned, of course, we've had Gaza as well on top of that. Our office in Gaza was blown up or was hit by 2 Israeli tank shells fired deliberately into our office, targeting the server room where our live video feed was. So, you know, these are unprecedented sort of times for us. So, yeah, it's had a big impact on the newsroom. It's forced us to, you know, look under every rock to find a better and safer way to do things. I think the protocols that we've managed to bring in Ukraine, I think have been great. I think we've really changed the way we do that. And I think it was really important to show the newsroom that you're doing things, because there's a natural understanding or natural thought in the newsroom that if you lose someone, you must have done something wrong, or the management must have not done something right, or, you know, it really shakes the foundation of a newsroom. So you have to have responses, and you have to show also that you're taking steps. You have to show steps that don't. I think the other thing to bear in mind is also what we've seen from the last 2-3 years, Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon, is the complete change of the risk, you know, paradigm, I suppose. Totally different war, totally different conflict. Drones. I mean, drones is the one word that, you know, emerges from the last, you know, 2-3 years. I mean, everybody has eyes on you. Everybody is this far away from dropping a grenade, a bomb, a missile on your head. And then taking it one step further, where I think the whole populist campaign against media has devalued journalists' life to such a degree that with these drones in the sky, putting TV on your car or putting TV somewhere or press or something, actually, maybe that's just actually making you a target, actually. And that's a real big change in the kind of risk paradigm. Not only do you have to be anonymous, but you have to be anonymous safely. And I think, you know, that's a huge change. And for us, that means changing all the types of training that we're doing. You know, obviously previously HEFATs were very focused on Afghanistan, Iraq, checkpoints, you know, that kind of, you know, that sort of asymmetric warfare. And now we're into all kinds of different issues that we're really having to. So the overhauling of training is immense. I think my training budget for 2025 on security has gone up. It might be good for you, Colin. Has gone up, but 200%. I've managed to get through, because that's the reality of what we're facing.
Well, actually, we don't deliver hostile environment training, but I know there are a couple of hostile environment trainers on this call, so I'm sure their eyes have lit up in glee. But let's talk about and I'm conscious that we're talking a lot about the safety and not so much the horizon gazing. I want to swap to just talking about the future of the Middle East. I mean, it's obviously, you know, a myriad of different countries, but what's the conversation in the FT, Oksana? How, you know, what do you see the future of Gaza, Syria, Lebanon? How are you staffing? How are you going to deal with this rapid change that the Middle East is going through?
I think there are a few aspects to it. It's the change that Middle East is going through, what happens next, and also that basically the effect of what's going to happen in the US Trump administration, and how the influence that it's going to have on the Middle East and other regions. Staffing, like I said, we work very closely with the newsroom and making sure that we have a plan for, well, all sorts of eventualities, and that we are on the same page for all sorts of eventualities. I would say that, I mean, if anything, Syria has shown us how quickly things can develop and how quickly the focus can go from one country, one area, one region, one conflict to something completely different. And we are used to taking things slowly, at least from our perspective. I'm not speaking from the newsroom or the editor's perspective, I'm speaking from an operational perspective, is basically going through every single situation, taking our time, liaising with you, Colin, in this case, and making plans. But there's also the newsroom who are operating at a different speed. So it is for us, as I think we've discussed on a couple of occasions now, is how do we adapt, and how do we basically adapt our speed as well, and our comfort levels of how quickly we can act and how quickly we can respond to the ever-changing situation in the Middle East and everywhere else, and what's going to happen 2025 post inauguration.
And Leila, this is your patch. What do you think is going to happen? I'm putting you on the spot. I know you don't like to make predictions, but
That is exactly what I said to you. Yes, I don't make predictions, but I will certainly, cast ahead on. I mean, who could have seen Syria coming, except for, of course, all the people inside Syria who did, because it'd been planned for a long time. But already we're seeing things there changing so rapidly. Of course, really good news out of Lebanon, the other day, not just new leaders after 2.5 years, but a prime minister who, is one that really believes in social justice and establishing a country kind of for everyone. Obviously, I've spent years reporting on the ground there against the horrific injustices against people perpetrated there. So in that way, we may see something positive. Look, there are positives here. For Lebanon, of course, that's hugely important. If Lebanon can reestablish itself as a country that's a financial center, that's a tourism center, that's a trade center, that port can get up and running again, that's incredibly good news for the Middle East. The other thing is Syria affects Lebanon very positively because if Syrian refugees do find that they can safely go home to Syria, which so many of them want to do. I mean, the border was packed from 3 hours after Damascus fell. Syrians are desperate to go home, many of them. That takes a huge amount of pressure off Lebanon, financially, and in terms of the large amount of damage that was done by the IDF during the recent war, in terms of living capacity, in terms of buildings, etc., etc. Then inside Syria, that also means that they've got a strong partner in Lebanon, a Western-leaning partner, likely with Nawaf Salam now in charge. That gives kind of more trust and a safe base for allies to go in and kind of base themselves out of Lebanon and be willing to work with Syria to try and rebuild infrastructure, which is the biggest thing, of course. 3/4 of the major infrastructure in the country of housing, in the areas that were hit is still completely destroyed of what was destroyed during the war. I mean, I've never seen such continuous destruction in my entire career. When you drive along, it's just there's nothing there and people are going back trying to find their homes. So if that can start to rebuild, that's really the first thing, is investing in homes and businesses and getting basic services up and running. If all those things start to function well, we're seeing a huge reduction in the power of Iran. They've lost their foothold inside Syria. Hezbollah hugely undermined, firstly, of course, by the war and the destruction of so much of their capability, but then also by this new leadership they made a compromise on the president and then feel that they've been undercut by the new prime minister in Lebanon. So that, again, hugely undercutting them. All of those things hugely sway the power balance away from Iran, which means that a lot of parties inside Iraq are then going to potentially start feeling that it's not really in their best interest to be dancing to Iran's tune anymore. Now, all of that then brings us back to what's happening with Israel and Gaza. It does look like the ceasefire is going to go through. That's miraculous for the tens of thousands of civilians in Gaza who have just lived in a way that no human being could imagine for so long now. Now, the ceasefire is, the 6 weeks, fine. We're going to see hostage exchanges. We're going to see prisoners released. Beyond that, we've still got the basic issues of the fact that Israel wants Hamas gone. Hamas isn't going anywhere. They've got many new recruits already as a result of the suffering that the Strip's gone through, so they say. And Hamas also wants all of the Israeli troops out of the Strip, which isn't going to happen either. However, the fact that things are looking more positive in a lot of the rest of the region is likely to mean that there is a lot more pressure now on Israel to make this work, because it's no longer, oh, well, look at us in the middle of all these chaotic and difficult countries. It's potentially, well, everyone else is moving down quite a positive track for their people, and this needs to work out too, and we need to find a long-lasting solution. Jordan, as it often is, has played kind of such an important role in negotiating in these various conflicts, and hugely important in Gaza.
And very quickly,
I
mean, what do you think this means for Iran? Is this the year that we see the Ayatollahs fall?
Again, no predictions. What I would say is, I mean, it's not just about this, right? Obviously, they're hugely weakened, but they were already weakened during COVID with a lot of their loss of leadership. They never really recovered from the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. They haven't had this. They don't have anybody with the same kind of pull on the people and ability to kind of mastermind, the way that their various allied militias work in the way that he does. And of course, Khamenei is on his deathbed. I mean, that's the huge, here that there's a whole kind of struggle for power there, because he wants it. Essentially, he hasn't built up anybody else to be his successor. He wants it to go to his son. The whole point of the revolution was that it's not supposed to be a hereditary leadership. So for a lot of people, that makes them very angry. So whenever he is, and he's had several serious illnesses recently, it's all kept very quiet. But the reality is, if he dies or becomes very seriously ill, and there's suddenly a power vacuum at this point when really these structures that the Islamic Republic has spent so many years trying to set up are all so unstable. If there was a time recently, it's now.
Okay, and Phil, how does AFP cover a disintegrating Iran?
Yeah, I mean, it's a discussion we have all the time. Again, we are, I think, one of the few or only international news organizations that still has a bureau in Tehran, and we still have both Iranian and foreign journalists there, which is a complex discussion all the time, knowing especially that Iran loves a bit of hostage diplomacy. We saw recently with the arrest, obviously, the Italian journalist, and then there's a long history going back with Jason Mazzari, the Washington Post, etc., etc. So we have this sort of constant thing of what we can do there, if it's worth having people there. And every time we talk about perhaps scaling down, thinking because it's so hard to work there as a journalist. Of course, it's put on the table. Yeah, but maybe this is the year. Maybe this is the year when a lot of things would happen. I mean, I think, as Leila said, I mean, there are a lot of weaknesses there. I mean, there's been a huge blow for them, Syria, what's happened in Hezbollah, and just the internal weaknesses. We've seen in the past 2 or 3 big popular protest movements that at some moment you thought, hey, this is gonna take it down, and the system has held, right? So we don't get ahead of ourselves, but obviously the health and the age of Khamenei does put this question very much on the agenda. And if that goes, that'll be a hell of a story around sort of imploding in that way. And also from a security perspective, would be, pretty concerning as a worry for you. Just, I think, to go back to Israel, I think the one slow burner, I think, is the West Bank. I think, if you look at what's happened in the West Bank since October 7, it's pretty out of control. The kind of settler military units, I get the word that comes up often is pogrom, I suppose, against, some of these Palestinian villages and so on. And I think, that there's a lot, that's a powder keg, I think. And the other issue I would say is Netanyahu and his right, some of these people that are in his government who are capable of, being egged on, especially by the Trump administration, or seemingly in their mind by the support that would come from the Trump administration, creating more divisions in Israeli society. And I think that's one to watch, because those divisions from before the war are not healed. And so, there's a lot of instability and a lot of threats to the media inside Israel for we've seen it with Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, which is under a lot of pressure. We've seen, obviously, Al Jazeera being banned and so on, but there's a lot of pressure on the media in Israel as well.
Okay, given the time, I want to broaden the prism, and you mentioned Trump, and obviously you discussed how there are conversations going on at AFP about the fall of Iran, and this is what news organizations do. We're always planning for the future. Oksana, how is the FT going to cover an invasion of Greenland? And I say this slightly tongue-in-cheek. Have you got a plan?
We always have a plan, Colin, but obviously it depends how things escalate. How things progress.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm obviously joking slightly. I'm hoping there won't be a military invasion of Greenland. Who knows? We live in uncertain times. But
Very.
we talked a lot about, you have a big office in the US. A lot of people. What's the mood? How is the FT coping with a fast change in the administration?
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty. I can't deny it. Vulnerability, what's going to happen next, and what do we need to be prepared for? As we've seen in the first administration, the approach to journalism, the approach to news organizations, to media organizations, especially foreign media like us, there poses so many threats. So we have to be prepared for tax threat, visa threats, basically just investigations, subpoenas, all of that. There are so many different angles to be prepared for. And I have to admit, it's quite challenging. It is quite challenging. So there is a lot of uncertainties. There's a lot of predictions. We have to adapt our processes. In the last couple of years, the focus has been on conflict zones, and now a huge focus is on the US. And it's not only the US itself, it's also repercussions globally. But in the US itself, there's a threat from so many different angles and so much to take into consideration. So there's, our viewers in the US, so there's journalists, obviously we have foreign correspondents. So it's the uncertainty, can we remain in the US? What happens next? There was a threat under the original administration, and I do think we'll probably face a similar situation this time around. And there's also, like I said, other things there's to take into consideration, and it's legal threats, it's insurance, it's subpoenas, it's all of the above. We're literally ticking all the boxes.
You're nodding.
Yeah, I would echo everything Oksana said. We're very much in a similar situation. We've got 150 people in the US. I think 75 are on J visas. So that immediately makes them vulnerable. There's the question of access, to what degree you can simply do your job. I think a big concern is the legal concern, because we've seen with Donald Trump, but also perhaps more importantly Elon Musk, that they're very happy to throw millions at nuisance lawsuits that they know the media can't defend or have trouble defending. We saw a really bad precedent in my view, which was ABC paying out a defamation to Trump, 15 million, on a case that many legal experts thought that they would win. Which for me, it encourages this idea that you can use the legal system as a weapon against journalism. I think there's also just the sort of general level of abuse that's been kicked up, be it on social media, be it by Elon Musk and those around him against media, which we get used to the online death threats. We get used to the online abuse, but that stuff does jump over, it does jump over into the real world, where the online abuse becomes, abuse just in the street. We see that all the time now, where you're covering events. I have journalists, photographers, video journalists on the ground, demonstrations. You're then threatened, you're spat on, you're abused, you're, with a particular focus on female journalists on the ground, I would say. So, they're just covering basic things now in the streets, not just in the US, but in many places. A level of aggression towards journalists because you spent 10 years saying you're liars, saying you're fake news, saying you're enemy of the people. And by the way, if you just repeat something 1,000 times, it has an impact. And so, there are multiple consequences from this for our staff, who I would say, and perhaps I think this is something general to the media in the States at this point, but from our staff, there's a great feeling of vulnerability at this point, I would say.
And Leila, you're the only representative of an American news organization. You're obviously based in the Middle East, but can you speak to this abuse? And do you think the American news organizations are prepared for what's coming?
I could certainly speak to the abuse. And also, you know, as an American organization, we are certainly concerned about, some of the comments were made about shutting down organizations that are seen to be liberal because they're neutral. We work incredibly hard at PBS to maintain our neutrality. That's often very, very difficult in such an incredibly polarized news environment. So that's something that we are certainly concerned about. We're worried about those pressures. In terms of personal threats, I mean, something that I think, Phil was just talking about there, and that we don't really think about enough is absolutely, the threats towards journalists individually have increased exponentially since Trump came into power the first time, but also just in the last decade, for various reasons. And, it used to be that the journalistic threat was essentially trying not to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, whereas now we're looking at being specifically targeted. Obviously, we've seen journalists targeted by the military in a more focused way than ever before during the war in Gaza, as well as the fact that the IDF has not really engaged in kind of journalistic protections in its other fronts as well. We just saw the same thing happening in Syria as well, where the IDF is posted right now, and journalists being detained and others being shot at. But as a woman as well, and as somebody who's on screen, this is particularly an issue for people who are on screen, but it's really an issue for all correspondents and anybody working in a kind of people-facing role. As the media changes and as social media becomes more and more important, and having multiple output for your media becomes more and more important, what we're seeing is that the kind of cult of personality, the cult of the individual, is more and more essential. Even in things like the newswires, traditionally a place like AFP would have, the idea is that it all comes from one body. But even now we're seeing, certain correspondents there starting to really put themselves out there and become very well known individually. Now, the Washington Post just fired their entire marketing department and said there is a new way this is done now. It's all about individual personalities. It's all about how journalists set up their profile and promote themselves. Great. So we're out there on social media. A huge amount of my work output is my social media, my multiple social media channels, everything going out there. I'm put on multiple shows all the time to advertise our work. I do all sorts of panels and conferences, etc. So everyone doesn't just know my face from television. They know me from everywhere. Now that's great because I'm promoting the brand and I'm very, very well known, by many people as a result of that. That also means that I'm a direct target. So anyone who doesn't like me because of something I say, because of who I work for, because of the fact that I'm a woman, because of the fact that I have a different political opinion from them, because of the fact that I might have said or done something they didn't like, asked a question, etc., has so many different ways to access me. The death threats every day, the rape threats every day. Israel and Gaza has sent it absolutely out of control. I have never received the kind of messages that I have received in covering this conflict. I mean, I don't, you sort of tell yourself no one could really hate me that much for doing my job. But it happens. We've seen it happen. So the question there is, firstly, how much responsibility do news organizations have to supporting journalists in that extra output they're doing in terms of fact checking, in terms of everything like that? But also in terms of how do you protect them when they need to be out there and as accessible as possible, and everything needs to be immediate because it's all about being first. But then people know where you are. They know exactly what you're saying, and they know exactly how to access you. And they have so many data points on which to find personal information about you. Many of us think about Jill Dando and what happened to her. So I think it's something that we really don't talk about enough now, the fact that we are asked to promote ourselves so much, and it's such a successful way of engaging the audience, but there's really no protection set up around it at all.
Okay, sorry to cut you off, Leila, but this is a very important topic. It's a topic by itself, but Oksana, if Leila comes into your office as one of your reporters saying, I'm experiencing this kind of abuse, how does the FT handle it? How, structurally, what is in place to help people?
Well, we have different levels of support. And the physical risk is one thing, but there's also a psychological risk that I feel is underestimated very, very frequently. Again, the focus, I don't know if I don't think it's just the FT or particular to the FT, but the focus has been on conflict zones, on what journalists are seeing there, what pictures desks are seeing, that what's coming from Gaza, what's coming from Beirut, what's coming from regions. But in terms of social media, in terms of the psychological effects on journalists that are facing threats from everything that Leila has just described, I don't think it's particular to any one individual organization. I think that is so common and potentially underestimated, that it's what I find that the support that's, well, I'll be perfectly honest, this is something that we've only seriously addressed, proactively addressed as to the next level, and it's not just internal helplines. Our office, human resources, is seeking specialized external support, is for that level of threat, and from all the different channels that it's coming from, as Leila described, is focusing on that. The psychological aspect of that is also culturally changing the approach to that, is getting people like Leila to actually walk into our office. That's the first step. Talking about it, communicating with our staff, repeating ourselves at the risk of repeating ourselves, and repeating ourselves fairly frequently. Come talk to us. If you don't feel comfortable talking to us, because we are, we're out there, we're visible, we deal with everything operationally, there are other channels, confidential channels, but come to someone, raise this. This is the psychological effects. I mean, I am repeating myself here, are tremendous. And the focus for so long has been on the physical aspects, and also basically being in the conflict zones, and being, participating in events, being in Washington, D.C. at the moment, or for the last few years. There are risks there. There's the consequences to, you are exposed. You're a journalist, you're part of a media organization, you are exposed from so many different angles. And it's changing for us culturally, raising awareness of that, getting the expert advice, and making sure that the trust is there for our journalists to come to us. Oh.
I'm dreadfully sorry. I seem to have dropped off there for a second, so I lost you at the end, but I'm back. Slight panic over.
Was it something I said, Colin?
Yeah, you offended me so totally, Oksana. I just decided to leave. I'm just conscious that we have a few questions, and one of the questions, there are actually quite a few questions which I should have addressed earlier, but one of the questions is about, and I'm conscious of two things. One, I haven't addressed Asia, Africa, or Latin America, which are huge topics in themselves, but let me ask this question that's come through the chat about how can we help citizen journalists, and what is the role of citizen journalists today, and should they be given a role, and how can we help them more? Phil, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, I have to say it's not a phrase I love, citizen journalists, because in this world of disinformation and misinformation, where both Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk think that their platforms can be sort of audited and fact-checked by the community who have no journalistic training or background, people need to understand what skills journalists bring to the table. People are trained, people approach the gathering of information with a kind of ethical framework and rules and so on, which I think are important. So for me, my main focus is really about media literacy. I think that's the absolutely the most important thing, to try to teach people to understand where verified information comes from, because we are working in an information ecosystem now which is pretty much collapsed, and so even extremely well-educated people have real difficulty understanding where their information came from. Oh, I saw something on Facebook, or well, what on Facebook? Was it a Financial Times article on Facebook, or was it Bob who lives next door? Where did it come from? So I think for, be it at a government level, be it at a media level, at a schools level, for me there's an enormous project globally around media literacy. So we're very engaged with a lot of different projects on that. But I think that's for me is where the crisis is.
Okay, and then very quickly, one other question before we wrap up. or two other questions before we wrap up quickly. HEFAT training, is it still fit for purpose? Leila, you are training people in Lebanon out of your own pocket. What do you think about HEFAT training? Is it still worth it?
It should be clear that I'm organizing people to be trained by professionals, not training them myself, but I am organizing the training. I do think it's fit for purpose. I think a lot of things need to be adapted. I think there, for instance, needs to be much more of a focus on women and women in the field, as we've talked about a lot, Colin. I think many new things need to be introduced for things we're facing, like drones, like personal attacks, all those sorts of things. And I also think that there needs to be essentially a policy set where some sort of certification has to be in place, and that has to be accompanied by the correct equipment in order then for a company to be able to go and commission that person. I think that's the step that now needs to be achieved. It's very random, haphazard. When is there a time for one? When can we set one up? Oh, you haven't done one yet, we'll figure it out. Oh, you don't have a flak jacket, we'll figure that out. I think that all needs to turn so that it actually leads somewhere, and it's not just something that you kind of stick on when you have the time, and that really only the people who are staff in organizations are getting regularly.
And I want to throw a hand grenade in this conversation very late on with 3 minutes to go. What is our role when, as foreign media organizations, when a country like Israel can just ban us from Gaza and there's just very little noise about it? Leila.
To speak out. I'm something that I've spent a huge amount of time doing is differentiating the difference between the fact that I'm neutral as a journalist. I'm not neutral on journalists being killed and journalists being targeted. Those are different things. And it is our responsibility as news organizations to speak out about our right to cover things and our right to be protected. Otherwise, this is going to continue. It's insane that we haven't been allowed into Gaza for 16 months. That should not be allowed. And it has not happened before in any place that we don't call an authoritarian state. If we don't keep pushing and we don't put those states under pressure who are behaving like this, then this is just going to continue. And being a journalist is going to become something that's optional for countries in terms of our access and in terms of our safety.
Oksana?
Yes, sorry, Colin. I would agree with everything that Leila's saying, and I would say our responsibility is speaking about it, bringing it to everyone's attention, not just accepting it as a reality.
Okay. And Phil, you obviously have had lots of people in Gaza. You've had to remove some of them. You've had to rebuild your network. You have been in Gaza, but you know, not having foreigners in there, what has that done to the reporting?
Yeah, I mean, it's been incredibly hard, and you know, I've taken the view from the very beginning that I will speak out, and it's not pleasant, the response you get in return, but I think it's shameful, the lack of pressure from governments on Israel to let people into Gaza, and the honestly pathetic response of, oh, we're just doing this because we want to protect journalists and we don't want to put them in danger, is just completely unacceptable. So, you know, we have to continue to speaking out. One thing, what effect did it have on us? Well, what it does is it manages to decredibilize the work of the Palestinian journalists and our team who are there, because it allows the Israelis to say, they're all Hamas, they're all Palestinians, you can't believe a word. You say, okay, well, if they all are, why don't you let us send people in from Jerusalem, from elsewhere, as we've done on every previous Gaza conflict, to work alongside them, to work together with our team, so that the production is a production that comes from a mix of Palestinian journalists and journalists from elsewhere and so on. If that's the case, they're all biased and they're telling a wrong story, let us in and do that. So it's a very cynical game, and there's a very nasty smear campaign against, well, certainly against our teams, which is completely outrageous. You would never say to an Afghan journalist, oh, you're Pashtun, therefore you're Taliban, therefore I can't believe a word that you say. You would never say that. These people are from Gaza. They work for an international news organization. You know, our journalists have worked for us for 10, 15, 20 years on staff. They obey our rules, our way of working. They've won international prizes. They worked in other countries. So, you know, I do find it's absolutely scandalous, the smear campaign against them. And I think it's scandalous that the lack of pressure on Israel to allow journalists into Gaza to work alongside them.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there and just say thank you very much to all the panel. Clearly, I did not manage to get around to, vast territories of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, who probably deserve their own webinar respectively. But it's very clear there are still a lot of uncertainty, a lot of difficulty, a lot of challenges ahead for journalists in 2025. In some ways, I'm quite heartened by that because it means that journalists are very important to the conversation. We have a vital role to play in informing people about what's coming up and what could happen. And I'm really very grateful to hear you speak so passionately about, getting into conflict zones, and hopefully if Taiwan is to happen, if an invasion of Greenland is to happen, you will be fighting to have journalists covering these stories as well. I want to thank you very much, and I'm going to leave it there and say, good luck with the rest of your day, your month, and the year, and thank you for the privilege of your time.